Hi guys, today we're talking about the 10 mistakes I made when I first got into houseplants. I didn't do any research at all, I just bought them and watched them die. Sometimes I water them loads, sometimes I wouldn't water them at all, and it was all wrong. So the first problem I had was I would always try to find plants that would survive in low to medium light. If you only have low to medium light, fine, but chances are somewhere in your house you will have bright indirect light. I would go for a plant that prefers brighter light than lower light. Once you get into plants a bit more, then you can start going for the lower light ones. The reason I suggest this is that plants that would naturally live in lower light situations their whole lives have adapted to grow and survive in a way that means they don't need to rely so much on light. They still need light, but other things are more... So everything else... Basically, if you give your plant a lot of light, all other sins can be forgiven. So if you let it dry out, if you overwater it, the light can give it the energy to get past that, to a certain point obviously, but with plants that like lower light, they are far pickier when it comes to humidity, water quality, temperature, drafts. They won't tolerate lack of that because everything needs to be perfect for them to be able to grow because they don't have that extra energy from all the light. Even plants like pothos, yeah, when they're first born, as it were, they live below the rainforest canopy, but as they grow, they're designed to move towards the light. So if you keep them somewhere that's darker, it'll take them that bit longer to get off the ground, whereas if you start them and get them established somewhere where they have a lot of light, then that's more energy for them. So whilst some of the plants that are lower light are really beautiful, calathea and peace lilies and that kind of thing, but they're difficult for beginners to get along with. I was lucky because my house is quite humid, damp, whatever. So I had sort of an advantage. But if you've got a dry house, then I would go for plants that are more suited to that. And even if you think your house is really dark, and it might be, there will be some spots in it. Just have a look, see where the light hits various times of the day. And you'll probably have enough to keep something like a pothos alive. People always say to start with a pothos, but I think that's really good because even if you keep them, I would advise keeping them in brighter light, but if you keep them in lower light, then they will still grow. Whereas plants like calathea and things, there's just too much can go wrong when you're first beginning and it can get quite overwhelming. Once you know what you're doing and you know what they want and what they're lacking, it's much easier. But it's at the start when you sort of feel like you're a bit blind to all and you're like, well, what's going wrong? So pothos are brilliant. I mean, I keep mine here. This is a west-facing window. I keep mine here. I moved them all on Friday, just like having the pothos gang together. They're not all pothos, but you know what I mean. These like heartleaf finding, climbing things. They vary in terms of how difficult they are to care for, but that you'll find that even within different plants of the same species, you'll get ones that are a pain and ones that are easy. So my neon pothos is a pain, whereas this Trubii Moonlight, I don't actually know if that's in the frame. He just grows and grows and grows, and if he doesn't get enough light, then you get this vine. Let me just grab him. Yeah, so he's telling us that he's not getting enough light. I have moved him since then. So yeah, if I want him to grow more leaves. He is actually growing more leaves on this side. So it must just be this side that's a bit dark. But yeah, you get these, they have subtle ways of telling you that everything is not correct for them. But as it gets into summer, more light hits this room, and also the window's broken, so there's a bit of cardboard that's blocking some of the light, which is very classy, but there you go. In my experience, even more finicky plants that like bright light are less finicky than plants that like low light. So plants like fiddly fig are picky, but if you give them a ton of light and don't move them and water them properly, they tend to do okay, whereas calathea, they'll be fine for months and then they're like, no, I'm sorry, everything's gone terribly wrong and I'm gonna go all crispy, drop my leaves, get spider mites and die. That doesn't happen quite so quickly with plants that like bright light, just because they've got that extra energy from the light. Sort of builds their immune system, a plant's equivalent of an immune system. They just get the energy from the light and it makes everyone a lot happier. Whereas if you're trying to keep... The classic example is snake plants. So snake plants are the closest thing we have to a fake plant. Don't think you can't kill them, because you can. If they get cold, they'll die. You can keep one in a low light area and it will do fine. It might not grow, but if you put one in bright light, it will do really, really well because it'll grow quickly. But if you don't want that growth, you maybe wouldn't notice the difference because they're both staying alive. But if you have a snake plant in a dark area and one in a bright area and they both get mealybugs, the one in the dark area will be much more badly hit. Is that right? Much more badly hit? It will do much worse and it will have a harder time shaking them because it just doesn't have the energy. It's tired, it's sad. Whereas this one's like, I'll get rid of them. I don't know how. I don't know if they're just waiting for you to get rid of them. I suppose they'll be waiting for other bugs to come and take them away because they can't physically, like... But you know what I mean? This one has a fighting chance. This one is a dead plant walking. Or not. I hope that made sense. Right, the second issue is humidity. And humidity is one of those things that the big generic home decor magazine type websites, actual magazines, they don't really talk about that often unless they're trying to flog you a humidifier. What I would advise, you don't need to buy a humidifier if you don't want one, if you can't afford one, if you don't want to run one, it's not worth the... What is that noise? If it's not worth the energy, then get a, what are they called? Hygrometer. So a hygrometer is a little box that I'm not going to go and get, but it's a little box and it'll say on it the ambient humidity, the temperature, and that's about it. If it is, say, 50 and above, you're fine. Most plants will deal with that unless you're getting into the really sort of expensive, like a Monstera obliqua, they like much higher than that, but you know, we'll cross that bridge later. If you're spending over £1,000 on plant, then you can probably spring for a humidifier. But if your house is, say, 40% or below, the 40 to 50% range is fine for most plants. Some of the lower light plants like Calathea and things, they would much prefer it to be higher, but the majority of plants will be fine. But anything under 40%, I would stick with things that don't like high humidity. So, what have we got? Rubber plants, ficus, succulents, plants that live in more exposed areas. Snake plants will be fine. Dracaena are fine. Dracaena are fine everywhere. What is that noise? Mistake number 3 is getting pots without holes in the bottom or trying to fake drainage by putting rocks in the bottom. Now this is annoying because most plant pots, decorative plant pots that you buy, don't have holes in the bottom. We don't all want to mess around with a drill. I mean, once you get so far into plants and you start looking into like semi-hydro and leca, and then you're like, yeah, I can use them all as cash pots. But for the majority of us, it's a pain because you can't use them. What I do is I just keep the plant in the nursery pot and then put that in the decorative pot. Don't put rocks at the bottom to try and add drainage because it doesn't. Some people find it works fine, but I don't think it's worth the risk. What we want to be doing is watering so much that water comes out of the bottom. Okay, here is Editing Caroline, and I'm just going to do a brief explanation as to why you shouldn't put rocks in the bottom. So this is what we do want. We want lots of soil with the correct moisture level, and then there's a bit of saturated soil at the bottom, which will dry out over time. On this one, we've got rocks, and then we've got the same layer of saturated soil on the top, so these are the same size. But then we've got less of the correct moisture level, and then we've got roots here, which are in danger of getting root rot, and this is the gravel. And then, so basically when we water it, the water will go to the bottom because of gravity. And it's fine the first time because the excess water, which should be dripping through the hole in the bottom, will get caught here. And that's fine because if the layer of water's like just along the bottom, it won't hit this soil. But then the second time we water, if this hasn't evaporated and we don't know, like there's no way of telling if it's evaporated, then this will just get saturated. And the more saturated this is, this line will move up. So we'll end up with more saturated soil and less of the correct moisture level. So basically there's more soil in this one. This is called a perched water table because it just is. I think the theory is this gravel will work as drainage. So this saturated soil, the water can drain into the gravel. But the issue here, if you think about it, this soil is saturated, so it's absorbed the water. This gravel can't pull the water out, and the force of the suction in the soil is stronger than gravity. So the soil's absorbed the water. Gravity is not strong enough to pull it down. That would only happen if you added more water, and then this would just fill up. So, like, imagine if you got a sponge and you put a sponge on top of some gravel and you soaked the sponge. Yeah, the excess water, once the sponge had soaked up as much water as it could, then the excess would go into the gravel, but the gravel couldn't pull any more moisture out of it. And I think that's where the confusion arises. In short, gravel does not equal drainage. It can be done, but I think you're better off just putting the whole plant in its nursery pot in the pot. One of the reasons I have so many plants in terracotta is that they always have a hole in the bottom. But terracotta is brilliant if you're an overwaterer, but it's not when you're an underwaterer like me. What you can get, I think they sell them on Amazon. I've got one here, there's one. Is these little pot and saucer sets, and then on the bottom, oh look at that! On the bottom, I'm gonna tip soil everywhere. There's holes. I don't know if you can see, but I'm not tipping soil everywhere. Oh my god. So this is a better solution. They're pretty cheap as well, and they're really sturdy. This is T for 2. These kind of pots are fine. I don't particularly like the self-watering pots because they have a hole in the bottom and no way to. I don't like them. Self-watering pots are a whole other video. Mistake number 4 is watering weekly. Watering weekly works well with some plants. If you have a really big monstera, that will probably work fine. It might be a little bit too much. But for a lot of plants, especially beginner plants, things like succulents, snake plant, even plants that need to be kept moist like ferns, watering once a week can be too much for them. What you really need to be doing is checking the soil. I use a moisture meter for most of my plants, the ones that I've not repotted, because the soil's a bit denser and the moisture meter works better. But I tend to water around the 2 or 3 mark. If it's succulents, then 1, although it's March now, my succulents have gone outside. Probably a bit early. I'm in the north in the UK and it is too early, but I was rearranging them and I had no space for them, so out they went. They like the sun. There's a bit of frost. I don't think it's enough to kill them. I've gone off on a tangent again. If you are the sort of person that say you've got a really busy, important job and you've only got an hour a week to look after your plants, by all means go around and check them all, but don't just blindly go and water them all because you can end up overwatering them. Mistake number 5 is quite controversial because it's something that some people just do automatically and others don't, and I would recommend not, and it is repotting plants as soon as you bring them home. The reason people do it, and I 100% understand why they do, is because they don't want to bring in bugs and things in the soil. I'm very much of the mindset that you are going to get pests at some point. And whilst I don't invite them in, I don't panic about bringing them in. They'll happen. We'll clean the plants off and it will be fine. But the problem with repotting immediately is, especially if you buy your plants from a long way away or if you've had them shipped, that whole thing is stressful. It's really stressful for a plant. If you think about it, there is nothing about a plant that would suggest it's got any experience being moved, because in the wild, a plant goes in the ground and it stays there unless something traumatic happens to it, like an animal rips it out of the ground and it has to propagate itself, or there's a flood or high winds. It's only a stressful event to repot a plant. So I don't. I actually have an anthurium that I'll go and get it. This plant I bought last year, and she is in dire need. I mean, that's quite root bound. They're looking beautiful though. I mean, they're all coming out on the top. I got a cheap. But I can't actually remember when I got it. It must have been maybe October, November time. Personally for me, that's too late in the year for me to repot. If she was looking sad, I mean, these are just old leaves, I would repot. It's not, it's not worth killing a plant over. But I'm going to wait until, well, probably April. Maybe the end of this month, just depends when I get some more stuff. Because I just think it's easier on the plant if they're given the best chance possible. Whereas I know over the winter she was not going to grow. She put out this little leaf, but I knew she wasn't really going to put out any decent growth. So to me, I didn't want her overexerting herself trying to get her roots into the new soil when there was no need. I knew the roots weren't going to grow much more, so I've just kept her healthy, kept her watered, which I have to bottom water obviously because the water just falls straight through. But she's doing absolutely fine. Another thing I would suggest if you're new to the hobby, you can use bought houseplant soil, you don't need to make your own, but I would get some sort of amendment to add drainage. Perlite or orchid bark, I use both, but perlite and orchid bark are the best. It just helps the water run through, and perlite also absorbs water, so it wicks it away from the roots, but then the plant can absorb it if it needs it. This looks to just be in pure coir, which hangs on to a lot of water. So mistake number 6 is something that I'm guilty of, we're probably all guilty of, and that is buying too many plants at once and not quarantining them. I never quarantine my plants, and it bit me in the bum more times than I care to remember, but I don't really have anywhere to quarantine them. I could probably quarantine them in here actually. On here. Houseplant pests, when you're not used to treating them, can be quite overwhelming, especially if you've got expensive plants or you're new and you don't really know what you're doing. I'm just sort of used to it now, and it's part of having a lot of houseplants. But right at the beginning, you want to build your collection as quickly as you can. And I know I've been there, I did it, I've made mistakes, that's why I'm telling you not to do it, but I totally understand if you do. But what I would do is try and keep your plants away from each other as far as you can. Even if it's just like that far. I mean, thrips will jump from there to there, but they're less likely to than if their leaves are actually touching. I mean, they'd have to think about that. So just keep them apart. Try not to buy too many when you're first beginning, especially the all ones that need different care, because it's really overwhelming. But as I said, we all do it. It's part of the hobby. When you start going to garden centres and you see something, you're like, oh, I need that, and then you watch a YouTube video and they do a house tour and you're like, I want that one, that one, that one. But just, it can get overwhelming quite quickly. Mistake number 7 is putting your plants out on a sunny day for a bit of sun. Now, I do put my plants outside. It's amazing for them. The difference between a bright windowsill and outside in the shade is phenomenal. You would think that it would be bright on the windowsill, but the window absorbs a lot of the light. Don't put your plants out in the bright sunshine unless they've been acclimatised, because they will burn, and they burn weirdly quickly. Not so much here because the sun's never hot enough in the UK, but if you live somewhere where the sun gets hot, don't do it. Put them in if you want to put them outside, put them in the shade. You'll still get there'll still be a massive amount of light that they'll get. There'll be less chance that your plants will get burned. And burnt leaves. The problem with burnt plants is it won't kill your plant. Well, it probably won't kill your plant, but it can burn all the leaves. So you have to chop them all off, and then you're left with a load of roots, which isn't beautiful. Especially when you had a big leafy luscious plant and it just gets reduced to a box of dirt. So yeah, don't do that. I mean, a lot of people don't put the plants outside because of the bugs. I have about 10 lavender bushes, so we get a lot of insects, and we get a lot of beneficial insects. We get loads of ladybugs, hoverflies, that kind of thing, and they're predatory and they'll eat the bugs. So I'm quite happy to have mine outside. Also, when I like to treat my plants by just hosing them off with water regularly. I do use like neem oil, and I have a spider mite spray which doesn't work, but I've found that just hosing them off regularly works better, and you don't end up with like burnt leaves and stuff. And hosing them off with a hose gets the job done a lot quicker than having to like run them under the shower head individually. So I do like to put my plants outside, but just be careful when you do it that you don't do it too quickly. Whap them out in the sun and then they die. I know it's hard because plants love light and they get a lot of energy, but they are delicate, they're not used to it. They need to build up a bit of tolerance, just like we do. But after a few weeks, I mean, some plants will never want to go in the bright sunshine. A lot of plants that like bright and direct light, if you acclimatise them properly, they will thrive in brighter light, but you will need to acclimatise them properly. And also, use your initiative a bit. If it's super, super hot, so hot that you couldn't sit in it comfortably, bring your plants in. They won't like it either. Mistake number 8 is watering with cold water. This will not kill your plants, but it can shock them, and that can impact their immune system and make them weaker and more susceptible to pests. I mean, you probably could kill them. I'm not great at this because up here in my office, I actually tend to just empty my glass into any that look dry, but then I go and fill it up from the bathroom tap, which is always freezing. There's a couple of things I do. I fill the saucers, and then by the time it reaches the roots of the plant, it's probably acclimatised a bit. But I also will only water plants that don't care so much. In general, it's best to let the water come up to room temperature. So what I would recommend you do is fill a watering can, or as big a receptacle as you can, with tap water or whatever water you're using. Let it sit for a couple of hours so it gets up to room temperature, and water your plants in the order that they're most sensitive. So start with the expensive ones, and or start with your favourite. But just bear in mind, you're saying this and you're like, oh, or you could just add a bit of warm water in. That would work equally well. I do that. A bit of warm water just to bring it up to room temperature. There is a rumour, it's not a rumour because it is kind of true, if you leave tap water out overnight, the chlorine will go. And it won't go completely, but it will, a bit of it will have evaporated. So it's probably not enough to make a difference depending on how much chlorine there is in your water. I live in North Yorkshire and we generally have great tap water. We've never had a problem with it, apart from this Pelia that used to be really healthy and fine, and then was it this year, it's got all these mineral deposits coming out of the holes on the bottom of the leaves, and it's suddenly just taken a hatred to the tap water. So I think I might have to move him. Oh, there's a little baby there. So yeah, not all plants will do. I mean, this is really obvious. These little white dots on the bottom of the leaves, that's sort of hard mineral and salt deposits. But a lot of plants don't do that. You might notice at the edge of the ends of the leaves get little brown marks, or even the edges of leaves. It can be a humidity issue, but it can also be a water quality issue. And sometimes you get like what look like watermarks on the leaves, and that can be mineral deposits coming through. But the point of this was, don't water with freezing cold water. Unlike many of the points, yeah, I do it, but it can damage your plants and send them into shock. It's important for beginners, I think, because you might not know that your plant's going into shock. It can be hard to tell. Plants keep that kind of thing pretty quiet. But if you set yourself up to succeed, then you've got more chance of keeping your plants alive and healthy. Right, mistake number 9 is putting your plants into larger pots. I'll bring the Pilia back, but I think we all know that's into a bigger pot. When you uppot a plant, especially say you get a tiny baby monstera and you plan on growing it into a great big massive monster, it can be tempting to just go and grab the biggest pot you can find and put it in. And if you're growing in leca, that would be fine. I think definitely more fine than in soil, but the problem with doing it in soil is you end up overwatering by proxy, because you soak all the soil and the soil has much more water in it. It's holding more water because there's a higher volume of soil. So it will take much longer for the soil to dry out, and in the time it takes, the plant can end up with root rot because there's not enough oxygen in the soil. So it's hard to say how big to uppot your plants to, but they say sort of don't go bigger than 1 inch to 2 inches. So when I pop this one up, I'll probably put it in a pot this big. You see the difference there? And that's probably a bit too big, but obviously the roots on this one are they're ready to go. But generally, yeah, we're looking about 1 inch more. And the last mistake, and I've already touched on this, and that is panicking at the sight of pests. If you just go into it knowing at some point a thrips will happen. Aphids are normally the first to crop up just because there's so many of them in garden centres. And yes, they're a pain and they're annoying and they can kill your plants if you don't get to them quick enough. But by and large, they all require the same elimination method. As I said, I just rinse mine off, but you can use neem oil. They all pretty much respond to the same thing. There's loads of things people do. People do hydrogen peroxide, alcohol, loads of things. I'm just lazy and prefer to wash them. But if you go in knowing that at some point it will happen, you'll be more prepared for it. As soon as you sort of realise this is something you might be getting into, buy yourself some neem oil in a spray bottle, just so you're ready. I would definitely recommend preventative measures. So when you clean your plants, spray them down with a bit of neem oil and then just wipe the plant down, because the neem oil, it interferes with, it's horrible. It interferes with the hormones of the insect and they stop eating and they stop reproducing. So it's not a quick fix, but it does work well for getting rid of populations. If you want a quick fix, then literally just rinse them under the tap. Most pests you can see. I would say spider mites are probably the hardest to see, because by the time there's enough of them that you can see them, because normally you see the webbing first. There's a lot of them. If you can get to them before the webbing and just keep the plants wet, they can't make the webs, and that makes them much more exposed and they don't like it and they're more likely to move on or die. There's a lot of talk about which pests like which conditions. So thrips don't care. Spider mites don't like the wet. They like a dry, arid, hot environment, but that it's not enough to keep a room humid. I found that spider mites love humidity loving plants like calathea, so a humid room isn't enough to keep them at bay. But if you keep the plant leaves wet, they can't reproduce very quickly, so I just shower them every day. It's not great for the plants, but it's better for the spider mites. And I have found that spider mites like quite thin-leaved plants, and as I said, they like plants that like humidity. So the plants that get spider mites tend to be the ones that lived in the rainforest, and in the rainforest it might rain every day, so they are used to being wet. It's fine. Right, I think that's the 10 mistakes. I don't know what the weird banging noises were. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you tomorrow. Alright? Yeah. Thank you. Bye.